We're in World History, Chapter 8, Part 2, and actually Part 2 of Part 2. And we got to the reforms that were happening in Rome and those that were standing up for the poor. And we got to the Gracchi brothers, and we saw what happened with them as they championed the cause of the poor. The wealthy senators opposed them, and then 300 of their followers were murdered. And so we see that with Tiberius Gracchi, and as we went down, also Gaius Gracchi in 123 BC, his brother. And as he tried to help the poor, he ended up committing suicide and 3,000 killed. When they say committed suicide, lots of times it was that they were made to commit suicide, so whether he committed suicide or he was killed, now they think possibly murdered. But in those times, the nobles did not want someone to champion the cause of the poor and take away any of their lands, because they were all very aristocratic. They were all very wealthy. So the first civil war now happens, and we have some more leaders that are going to stand up for the poor, and we're going to have some problems, and not only problems, we're going to have a civil war. What's a civil war? It's the war within the country. It's so that Rome was divided into two sections, and these sections would fight between themselves. So we have two leaders. Now we had the Gracchus brothers, and now we have Marius and Sulla. So Marius and Sulla. Marius being the idol of the masses, working for the people, and Sulla working for the wealthy Senate, and some of the political corruption that was going on there. Here's Sulla he had his face put on their coins. And we have this first Roman Civil War. So it's going to be a test. What was the first Civil War? It was from Gracchi. Remember the Gracchi brothers? Really it started with the Gracchi brothers, but now we have Marius standing for the Gracchi brothers, and then Sulla standing for the Senate, and making it not only just a conspiracy, now it's a civil war. So Marius being the idol of the masses and Sulla the champion of the Senate, they fought Rome's first civil war here, and Sulla becoming victorious over Marius. So Sulla, you'll see how Sulla wins. Of course, he has the wealth of the Senate behind him. And so Marius ends up fleeing to North Africa. In North Africa, he gathers an army together to come back to fight for the poor, fight for the masses. He enters Rome triumphantly in 87 BC, and then he began killing hundreds of these Senate supporters. So we got a war going now, not just the Gracchi, brothers being put to death, but now we have Marius with an army to fight the poor. Sulla's dictatorship. After Marius died, as Sulla raised up the Roman Empire army, Sulla returned. He was gone when first Marius came, then Marius died. Sulla returned to Italy in 83 BC at that time, and then he waged a 2-year civil war against Marius's supporters. So Marius was killed, and then he had a lot of supporters. And so Sulla said, we have to quench these guys and we have to get rid of these guys. So Sulla triumphed and instituted a reign of terror. And he started executing anybody they thought were followers of Marius, who was standing up for the common people. But now we have Sulla triumphing over and executing all these people as an example. If you stand up and if you rebel in this area, you will be executed. So 5,000 people is quite a bit. They executed 5,000 people. And then Sulla appointed himself as dictator for an unlimited time period. So he became the civil war. You think of civil war, then he became the first dictator at that time. And he reorganized the government and gave the government to the Senate. So he said he did want the Senate to control. He was the dictator until he could give the Senate control. Because his whole idea in his mind was that we need the Senate. And Marius was the Senate was not. So the Senate was, the representatives were politically corrupt at that time. And so that's what they had, the war between the Senate and the common people, actually. And then Sulla then resigned in 79 BC, and he died a year later, but he gave the control over to the Senate. The Senate's control, though, was very short-lived. That means they didn't control very long. Here's a picture of the Senate, how they would get up and argue in the midst of the Senate, or get up and present their case, and, the tribunals and such. Here's a picture of it. So I always think of tribunal, but I think of Jesus when they put him with the tribunal. Anyway, Senate's authority meant little without support of Rome's legions and professional soldiers. The soldiers gave their allegiance to their commanders, not to the Senate. So what happened? We have a split there. The Senate was in control, but guess what? The commanders, the soldiers did not. They were mainly common people that were soldiers, and they did not support the corrupted Senate at that time. And so now the Senate would be short-lived because basically they do not have control of the military at all. The Second Civil War. So we had the First Civil War with Marius and Sulla, and now we have the Second Civil War we're going to be talking about. You're going to have to kind of write these down, and you'll know, and put them in order so that you know, because we're going to go through a lot of different war times with Rome especially. So the Second Civil War, there were struggles for power, and now we have a man named Pompey. Here's kind of a rendition of what Pompey looked like. And he 108 to 48 BC is the time that he lived. Well, Pompey came in, he was a general, Roman general, and he conquered Syria and Palestine. He was the one general that conquered and subdued them, and he eliminated the pirates on the seas. So he was a hero at that time. And then he wanted to reward his troops because he said his troops had done such a good job and had jumped through all kinds of hazards. And so he wanted to reward his troops by granting them public lands. But he went to the Senate, and they refused to give any rewards to the military. So right now we have a split again between the military and the Senate. This formed what was called the First Triumvirate. Remember that word, the First Triumvirate. What does tri mean? 3. Like a tricycle has 3 wheels, triumvirate. So triumvirate, we're going to have 3 guys. This middle guy we're going to talk about is going to be the main guy, and you'll recognize him. His name is Julius Caesar. So the first triumph was Julius Caesar, who lived 100 to 44 BC, and he was a nephew of who? Marius. Remember Marius that fought against Sulla? Marius that represented the people? Marius that represented the poor. Julius Caesar was his nephew. So Julius Caesar sort of, in that way, came to represent the populace, the popular people. And indeed he did. So Julius Caesar became a rising leader for the people. And then he came to Pompey's aid. Remember, Pompey wanted to reward the military, and Julius Caesar, he wanted to reward the military. He was a military man too. And so Pompey and Julius Caesar were actually good friends in the beginning. We'll see what happens with that. In 60 BC, they joined with Crassus. So we have Crassus, and we have Julius Caesar, and then we have Pompey. So Crassus is the other one, which we don't hear very much about, but we hear a lot about Pompey and Julius Caesar, because we'll find what happened between the two of them in a minute. So they formed the first triumvirate, and then 3 ruled together, and Julius Caesar was elected consul. Remember, there's 2 consuls. They usually had 2 consuls for the Senate. So he was a consul. And Julius Caesar bypassed the Senate then and said, since he was a consul, he bypassed the Senate. He didn't really care about going through all the Senate. And he took Pompey's requests for the military, remember, to give the military rewards, and to the assembly. The assembly had a lot of military people in it. So he went to the assembly and they granted these requests for the military. So the military, the soldiers would get their rewards. So Julius Caesar, so he had this 5-year appointment as governor of Gaul first. So let's talk about this. So he was the governor of Gaul. Where's Gaul? Gaul's up north. And he actually had subdued for 9 years, subdued the Gauls. So he fought 9 years with the Gauls. And then he extended Rome into this area of the Gauls, which was now France, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Germany. He subdued them, all the Gauls in all of that area. And then he even invaded Britain, England. He enhanced these victories by descriptions in his commentaries on the Gallic War, or the Gallic War. So I would say, I call it Gallic because I think of the Gauls. The Gallic War, he wrote a book about it. His book, when I say book, and those times they didn't have books per se, they were more a series of stories or series of commentaries put together from Julius Caesar, and it became a bestseller in Rome. Julius Caesar became a hero because they read about him, all that happened, and all of his battles, and said, man, he's our hero. Julius Caesar in the Senate. Well, because Julius Caesar was such a hero and so popular, the Senate became fearful. The Senate feared of Julius Caesar's popularity among the common people, and Pompey grew jealous of him. His friend, Pompey, who he had supported, grew jealous of Julius Caesar. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. So the Senate said, he's out there fighting wars in Gaul and up there and towards England and bringing in and taking care of his military. And they loved Julius Caesar. The soldiers loved him. And then the Senate sends a message out and says for him that he needed to disband his army, get rid of his army, and return to Rome and just be a private citizen, not being a leader in any way. So, of course, Julius Caesar thinks, what? What are they going to do to me? And he thinks Pompey is jealous and what's happening? So Caesar disobeys and crosses the Rubicon. The Rubicon was the border between Gaul and Italy. So they told him that he needed to disband and come home. Instead, he brought his military and crossed the Rubicon. He disobeys. This actually, he knew, now we're going to have a civil war. I'm going to be fighting against my old friend Pompey, and I'm going to be fighting against the Senate. So he's discouraged in that, but his military and all the people, wherever he go, they loved Julius Caesar. And of course, they were going to stand behind him. So today, even when you say cross the Rubicon, he said, well, you just crossed the Rubicon. That means an irreversible decision. He made an irreversible decision and knew that he would be going to war. So when you hear that word, well, they crossed the Rubicon, it just means, okay, now it's over. It's irreversible. I'm going forth. I'm going forth in wartime. Crossing the Rubicon is a saying we even use today. Julius Caesar triumphs. City after city. They had read his book, remember? And city after city opens their gates to Julius Caesar. And Pompey had to flee to Greece with his army, and the Senate had to flee too. As he was coming in, the popular people were all behind, and the military, all of the military, practically all of the military in Rome at that time were behind Julius Caesar. Although Pompey had to actually, pay some of his Roman by the Senate. So they basically had a civil war here between Pompey and Julius Caesar. It actually is the second civil war, as I said before. Caesar served briefly as emperor and held elections for a new Senate. So Julius Caesar triumphs. And now he says, we're going to have a Senate. We need a Senate to advise me. And so he decided to have elections for a new Senate. And then he was elected consul in 49 BC. Everything looked pretty good for Julius Caesar as he came into Rome triumphantly. Pompey and Caesar. Pompey had a large army in the eastern Spain that controlled much, and his army was paid well by the Senate, like I said before. And Caesar made rapid marches and defeated his enemies one at a time. And Caesar was a master of war. Caesar, one thing he could do, basically, he was a general, one of the top generals probably in history. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar crushed Pompey's army in Greece. So now Pompey's out of the picture. Julius Caesar conquest. 2 years later, he defeated the forces of the Senate in Numidia in Africa. Remember we talked about Numidia before with the Carthaginians, some Carthaginians. He launched a series of campaigns in Egypt, Syria, and Spain, conquering them all. And then he went on to Egypt. He met, at that time, the emperor, or I should say the pharaoh, it was Cleopatra. She was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So here we have this woman, and she was a young woman then. She was probably, not older than 16, 17, 18 years old, as he came in and he conquered Alexandria, where she lived. Remember the big city of Alexandria? And she was Ptolemaic, which meant that she was Greek in origin, as the Greeks had taken over northern Africa. And so here we have Egypt there, and here's a picture of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. She ended up, Julius Caesar fell in love with her, even though he had a wife, but his wife was basically a political situation in Rome. And so he wanted to marry Cleopatra and unite Egypt in this whole situation with Cleopatra, and bringing Cleopatra, actually triumphantly bringing Cleopatra into Rome. The Romans didn't like that of Julius Caesar. They did not want Egypt coming in and taking over any part of the rule of Rome. She was not Roman, and they did not want her involvement in anything. In fact, Julius Caesar, they wanted to marry her. He even had a child. They had one son. Julius Caesar, friend of the poor. So in 45 BC, he appointed himself dictator for life. He did appoint a Senate to help him, as we know, and he reduced the debt and provided employment on construction projects, and he initiated much needed reforms. So he did a lot of reforms. He reduced the debt. He introduced 365 1/4 Julian calendar. That's a calendar that we go by now, the Julius Caesar's calendar. And he had great plans for Rome and new construction. So all of these for Julius Caesar. But Julius Caesar's death on the Ides of March, and it's Shakespeare writes a play about it. In Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by a group of senators who hoped to restore the old republic. And some of these senators were his very friends. Brutus was one of his friends. In fact, the Shakespeare play says a tu Brute means Julius Caesar, right when he was dying, looked and he saw his friend stabbing him and says, "Even you, Brutus? Even you are stabbing me?" So a terrible time, the Ides of March, and it was kind of prophesied by an omen that said that he'd be killed on that day. 44 BC, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by the Senate. Italy plunged into chaos then of civil war. All the senators had to run for their lives because people had loved, the popular people had loved Julius Caesar. And he was, as he was going in reforms, he was doing this, and wherever he went, You know, he was a champion, except for bringing his relationships with Cleopatra. But anyway, so the Republic then was lost forever. So this was the end of the Republic. Now we're going to have a series of Caesars. And these Caesars are going to retake Julius Caesar's name as Caesar, but Caesar is going to mean the leader, or that godlike person. So from this point, they would not have a republic. So as the Republic was thought of being. The third civil war was the Second Triumvirate. Second Triumvirate. So when thinking of the Second of Triumvirate, we think of this man, Mark Antony. So Caesar was Caesar assassins. I think that says assassins, but assassins fled into the east. So Caesar's assassins fled, and then leadership came with Mark Antony, who was a friend of Caesar and a formal consul, and he was a general. And so he took leadership. And then Octavian would be Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew that was adopted by Caesar and also heir to the throne. So we have 18-year-old Octavian. Very important you know about this triumvirate that took over, or triumvirate. I hope I pronounced that right for you. And Octavian, and then we have Octavian and we have Mark Antony. And then in 43 BC, Antony and Octavian joined with Lepidus, and they formed the Second Triumvirate. And here's the Second Triumvirate. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, okay? Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Civil War again. 2,300 of their enemies were assassinated, including Cicero, the most famous orator and spokesman for the Roman Republic of all time. He was a friend of Julius Caesar, and he was assassinated. So this triumvirate, these three, one being a general, one being Caesar's adopted son, and the other two being a general, we have this whole thing. They're looking and pursuing now Caesar's assassins, and they defeated them and killed all of Caesar's assassins in Philippi, the Philippians. You may think of that in Greece in 42 BC. So all of Julius Caesar's assassins were killed, plus 2,300 of their enemies were assassinated too. And some of the senators that were very popular were assassinated. So now for sure we don't have a republic. So they divided the Roman world among themselves, the three of them. And 5 years later, Lepidus was forced out of the alliance. I don't know too much about Lepidus, but we know a lot about Mark Antony, and we know about Octavian, who would become Augustus Caesar. We know their lives. There's been movies made of it. Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian. So Mark Antony went to Egypt and joined in with Cleopatra. So now, remember, Julius Caesar had a son with Cleopatra, and he was gonna bring them into Rome, and Rome did not like that at all. Well, Antony goes to Egypt, and now he falls in love with Cleopatra. And he too had a so-called Roman wife that was a political type origin, like the arranged type marriage. And so he basically, had not much to do with his wife, and went and so-called married Cleopatra. They actually had 5 children. So here's a picture, kind of a reincarnation of them. So, and anyway, he began to give away the Roman territory to her. So he loved her so much that he said, you are in charge of Egypt, and began to give away territory. Octavian took advantage of this to arouse the public opinion against Antony and wage war. Remember, Lepidus is gone, and now the two of them, and we have Octavian, who will become Augustus Caesar, going against younger guy who's only like 18 years old, going against Mark Antony. They had the battle at Actium. What's the Battle of Actium? Well, in 31 BC, Octavian was at Actium on the coast of Greece, fighting this war against another type of civil war against Mark Antony. And this is one of history's most decisive battles. Octavian's army conquered the east. He claimed the land of the Nile for Rome. And Antony and Cleopatra both ended up, in the end, committing suicide because they were afraid of being captured and being made fools in front of Rome. So Octavian now was the master of the empire. Okay, well, went through that.